Let's take a few minutes to discuss the nature of the family in biblical Israel. Now, this is an incredibly complicated and massive topic that deserves a phenomenal amount of attention, but we're just going to be able to touch on it briefly within the scope of our historical survey. We will come back to many of these aspects in a much later video when we talk specifically about women. That's going to be an important part of today's brief lecture as well, but I'll explain why this is so challenging. I'd like to speak very briefly and in general broad strokes about the nature of the family from the earliest sources we have, basically Genesis, up until the end of the First Temple period, which is 586 before the Common Era. So that's a massive chunk of time. We're speaking about really over 1,000 years. So, we're generalizing very heavily within the space of a few minutes. Secondly, we should understand that it's very challenging to try to describe things which are so elemental to the human condition. I mean, we use the word family in a historical context, and we use the word family today. Family is, of course, something that all of us are wrapped up in extremely complex and deep-seated ways. Family is basic to our identity. And so it's very difficult to separate our own experience of what family is or ought to be from what we read in the textual tradition. For example, if you look at this classic image, it's Norman Rockwell's famous painting, Freedom from Want, which of course was featured in the magazines throughout the middle of the 20th century. And this is obviously a Thanksgiving dinner, and you see the happy family around it, and the patriarch and matriarch with multiple generations of the family members around the table, all smiling as they enjoy this large turkey, right? That's the title is Freedom from Want. But this is clearly an idealized image of what a Thanksgiving dinner would be like, right? Everyone's happy, everyone likes each other, no one's on their phone, no one's arguing politics, no one's wanting to get back to the football game. This is kind of like what we want family to be, but it's not necessarily what family actually is. So there were elements of an idealized meal that are shown here that we'd like to sort of project backward in time, but it would be absurd to say every single Thanksgiving dinner, especially in the year 1943. Think of what that must have been like, at the end of World War II and the battle in the Pacific and all kinds of very difficult times for Americans. This is clearly an aspirational Thanksgiving dinner. So when we go back and look at the family in biblical times, we're kind of trapped within our own mentality of human experience. And then furthermore, we can't read past what the text actually gives us as data. The text is moreover layered. I mean, we have the biblical text itself, which describes family to some degree, perhaps aspirationally for then in the ancient period. But then it is interpreted through the Mishnah, which we're going to speak about in later classes. But then that doesn't reach a textual form until centuries later. The Talmud still later. The Halacha, meaning Jewish law, still later than that. And then there's individual custom or minhag. So these textual layers, we're reading all of these things backwards to try and ascribe what we think a family should be to sometimes very fragmentary descriptions that go back thousands of years. So with that kind of caveat, let's try to understand at least a few basic things about the family in the ancient world, which may be somewhat counterintuitive to what we think today in the beginning of the 21st century. Perhaps one of the most striking aspects of the family in the ancient world is that one of the relative non-issues is race. Race is incredibly important in American culture, and this is, of course, the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade and the Civil War and civil rights issues, Jim Crow, which is still playing out. As I'm speaking these words, we're deep in a huge Black Lives Matter social justice movement that's rocking America in the context of a very contentious election. But race does not seem to be a significant category for the Bible. There are references to peoples, and there are occasionally references to skin color, but generally speaking, it does not seem to be a huge, issue. For example, here's a 17th century representation of Moses and his Ethiopian wife. In fact, she is described, Tzipporah, as a Cushi. She's also described in another context as a Midianite, and there's some dispute over what exactly that means. But the commentators don't seem to be especially bothered by the idea that Moses, who is presumably Semitic in racial characteristics, would marry an African who could be, theoretically Nubian, as we see in this particular representation. So race itself is not nearly as important as peoplehood. That is, who is your ethnos? To which ethnos does one belong? But continuing with gender, that's a far more important thing in the definition of the family in the ancient world. Whether or not one is born male or female is huge. There's a lot of discussion, which I think we won't be able to discuss it here for now, but heterosexuality is considered the norm, and homosexuality is deeply frowned upon, especially male homosexuality. There is a discussion in the Talmud later of multiple genders besides simply male and female, and perhaps we'll get to that when we get to more Talmudic discussions. But for the time being, let's focus ourselves on two sexes, male and female, and they're considered to be exclusive for the institution of marriage. However, that marriage can be polygamous. That is, one husband and multiple wives, as in the famous story of Jacob marrying two wives, Rachel and Leah, shown here in Michelangelo's representation. And in fact, there's kind of like a half marriage status, which is called a pilegesh in Hebrew, or a concubine in English. And a concubine is essentially like a wife in all respects, but lacking the protections that are inherent to marriage. As the Talmud defines it, again, later in the Jewish tradition, we have these definitions that are explained. A concubine may simply be dismissed at will, whereas a wife has a guarantee in her wedding for marital support during the marriage, and if the marriage is dissolved, then she has a right to support afterwards in the form of a financial settlement. We'll get back to that in just one second when we talk about divorce. It's also important that gender has relationship to the status of the children. Patrilineal descent is not recognized in much of Jewish history. It's not entirely clear what exactly is going on in the biblical text alone when you separate the biblical text from the later discussions of it in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the commentaries. It appears that there is patrilineal descent in many of the figures of the Bible. Joseph, of course, marries an Egyptian woman. Again, there's midrashim that would adjust that slightly. Same with Moses, who we saw earlier. Some commentators like Tosfot, just to continue this for one more sentence, Tosfot in the Middle Ages suggests that before the giving of the Torah, the law was patrilineal, that a child followed his or her father's status, and after giving the Torah, it became matrilineal. Certainly, for the huge bulk of Jewish history, Judaism has been strictly matrilineal until 1983, when the Reform movement introduced the idea of patrilineal descent. Again, I mentioned that in the last video. We'll have to come back to it in the 20th century. So at any rate, the mother is extremely important, whether or not the mother is a full wife or a concubine, or, as we shall see later, even a more casual relationship. Women also have very distinct status with regards to things like slavery. Jewish men may be enslaved. Jewish women may not be enslaved. Once they reach maturity, they may not be enslaved at all. They have a diminished agency, however. There are certain elements of legal practice, meaning, for example, serving as a witness and things like that. Again, I'm reading the biblical text through the lens of the later commentators of Mishnah and Talmud, but women seem to be at a diminished status when it comes to certain elements of their legal standing. And similarly, in terms of inheritance, the general understanding of women in the biblical period is that women are almost always existing, and it's considered to be an ideal status to be within the shadow of another male, either within the shadow of their father, that is, under the protection of their father, later under the protection of their husband, and finally in a widow status, then under the protection of their adult sons. There are always men who are protecting women. The idea of a woman who is separated from this is considered to be placing her at tremendous disadvantage. On the other hand, that does not necessarily diminish a woman's rights as a single person to engage in business, own land, affect contracts, and all kinds of things. Much more of this we'll discuss when we speak specifically about women later on in this series. But there's no question that it would be absurd to ascribe a kind of modern equality to men and women in the ancient world. This is a patriarchal society. The only thing I think is worth really debating is whether or not it is like a benign or beneficent patriarchy, if you want to argue that such a thing exists at all. The last thing I should point out is that in terms of the family structure, which was often multi-generational, living in the same household and things like that, is the idea of lineage. Now, the concept of legitimacy in modern terms, like whether or not someone is illegitimate, or to use a more colloquial term, bastard, it has a distinct meaning in the biblical tense. There is something called a mamzer, again, more fleshed out when we get to the Mishnah. But the offspring of a non-sanctioned relationship is not necessarily disadvantaged in their future lives. The only sanctions are applied, and they are very heavy sanctions, are when a marriage is prohibited, such as, for example, a marriage that involves a married woman and someone other than her husband, or a brother and a sister, or a father and a daughter, and so on. But relationships which could conceivably be consummated, but they have not, been officially sanctioned by religious authorities, nevertheless do constitute relationships that do not result in illegitimate offspring. And in fact, if I can cite my teacher, Rabbi Uziel Malevsky, he used to say that one should never cast aspersions at anyone's lineage or background, because in reality, when you look at the biblical line of the Messiah, it runs through some very sketchy relationships when you look at them on the surface, such as, for example, Judah and his widowed daughter-in-law Tamar, shown here in an extremely challenging passage in Genesis that usually is skipped over in grade school because it is really a little bit too racy. Or Boaz and Ruth's status, and then furthermore David and Bathsheba. All of these relationships all invoked certain questions of legitimacy, and nevertheless this is considered the line from which the Messiah will be born in the Jewish tradition. So one should never cast aspersions at anyone's family background. Okay, I hope you found that interesting. And we will continue with one final discussion of daily life in biblical history. We're going to look at ritual life very briefly. Thank you for watching.